The Garden of Eden, the biblical birthplace of all humanity.
The story is one way of showing how the human world came to be as we know it.
But is it just a story? Or did Eden really exist?
Every culture has a story that says this is how we came to be, this is what happened.
One maverick scientist was desperate to know the truth.
Why did they tell that story? Where did it come from? And what's behind it?
He risked everything to find the answer.
I would have expected backlash. There are people who don't believe it now.
This is the story of one man's quest for the Garden of Eden.
My rule is, if people think it's crazy, it's probably right.
In 1987, a respected magazine published an article about the work of a little-known archaeologist named Juris Zarins. In it, Zarins claimed to know the earthly location of paradise, the Garden of Eden. Zarins' work caused a storm. Many religious people felt it was sacrilege to apply scientific principles to the Word of God. It should be accepted on faith or not at all.
I would have expected backlash. There are people who don't believe it now. It's like anything else. I don't believe that, I don't want to know that, that's different, that's uncomfortable.
Some respected academics were also deeply skeptical. They thought Zarins was just wasting his time. Many biblical scholars thought the story was just an allegory, with no basis in fact.
Certainly by the 19th century, most educated people no longer think the story of the Garden of Eden is a literal account of the beginning of humanity and the fall of mankind.
But Zarins did not care about other people's opinions.
Most people are not interested in trying to think through. Let's put it this way. If I said to you, I'm going to research the Garden of Eden based upon the Genesis story, people are going to go, well, why?
Surprisingly, this was not a religious quest, nor was it a hunt for buried treasure or precious relics. It was a journey motivated purely by a thirst for knowledge. Zarins wanted to know about the origins of human society. And despite the fact he is a committed atheist, he thought that the answers lay in, of all places, a biblical legend.
A faith person will say, yeah, that happened, and I believe it, that's the end of it, okay? But a scientific person says, well, why did they tell that story? Where did it come from, and what's behind it? And then you start, like a detective, you start looking at it.
Zarins' archaeological career had a promising start. But despite his keen intellect, many people found working with him a challenge.
He's nuts. If someone has spoken with Yuri, they understand he's brilliant. The man is brilliant beyond words. But he is a little bit hard to follow. Intellectually, yes, he is truly one of the most intelligent human beings I've ever met. Socially, he's 5, but...
Perhaps because of his unorthodox style, finding an environment he could work in wasn't easy. But he secured a place at a small college in the heart of the American Midwest called Missouri State University.
I had to find a job, and you just don't get a job at just any old place. Particularly archaeology. Archaeological jobs are hard to come by in academic circles, so you take one where you can get it.
But rather than hinder his career, Zarins found his work at Missouri State helped him become something of a rising star.
This guy did things that news media covers. I mean, he made Smithsonian, Nat Geo, worked on projects that were, had huge budgets. So he brought press and money through the school, which is always good for the school. He was very much encouraged to do his own thing.
The freedom Zarins had at Missouri State meant he could pick and choose his own passions to follow. So he spent most of his time indulging his greatest passion: the vast deserts of Arabia.
The reason I love it is because it's so austere. It makes you come to grips with yourself. You have to learn about yourself. You have to learn about others and trust others, but you have to learn how to survive and how to suffer. I like that.
Arabia was also rich terrain for an up-and-coming archaeologist making a name for himself. Unlike the well-trodden sites of the ancient classical world of the Mediterranean or Egypt, Arabia was undiscovered country.
Arabia was a cultural landscape that was like a desert, literally, because archaeologists hadn't been allowed in. The tribes are too dangerous in most places in Arabia. It's so remote, many places are so remote. Believe it or not, I'm the first person sometimes to touch something that's 500,000 years old.
Zarins also developed a reputation as something of a maverick. He refused to follow the traditional academic career path and started taking, in effect, freelance commissions. He would work with pretty much anyone who had an idea he liked the sound of.
Works the same no matter who's paying for it, isn't it? Who cares?
These nonconformist methods led him to a project in Oman related to, of all things, a Bible story. The legend of the three kings bearing gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh.
Our real project was to find out and figure out the frankincense trade.
Zarins and his team set off into the vast Arabian desert. They wanted to know how long people had been trading frankincense and how it came to be such a valuable commodity across the ancient world.
Frankincense only grows a couple places in the world, and it originates in that Oman, Yemen region. We went on to study basically the trade routes, where it would have come from, how they would have transported it, what they were doing with it.
Zarins, Owen, and their colleagues worked in Oman's so-called empty quarter for more than 4 years, looking for evidence of trade routes stretching as far as India, Egypt, and Rome. And after an extensive search, they made an extraordinary discovery, a lost city called Ubar. Legends of Ubar can be found in the book of 1001 Arabian Nights, where it is described as a place of fantastic wealth and lush greenery in the desert. According to the Quran, it was supposedly destroyed by God as a punishment for its misbehaving king. Indeed, until Zarins found it, no one was even sure if Ubar really existed.
So we found this location, this oasis in the center of southern Oman, and we found out that this was the jumping off place where they were congregating and sending caravans. Hundreds of animals were being transported in this direction, and they were using frankincense, among other things, to trade.
And those trade caravans we know moved for centuries.
Zarins discovered that frankincense had been traded across the region for at least 8,000 years. From Ubar, frankincense caravans would have set off in all directions, including, of course, to the Holy Land. Along with goods to sell, these caravans would have carried something else, stories, including many that eventually found their way into the Bible. Zarins realized its authors borrowed some of their material from other cultures.
It's called plagiarism. They plagiarized it, stole it, and repackaged it. The Hebrew Bible repackaged the story that's much older and came from its proper location where people lived and experienced it.
Zarins began to wonder about the origins of one story in particular, the tale of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He wondered whether it was one of the stories that had been borrowed from another culture. Of all the many fables in the Bible, this one seemed to be based on real events.
When people wrote something down, they're not lying to you. It's not baloney. It's just that they don't think you need scientific evidence.
Zarins was convinced that the ancient Hebrew people who wrote the Bible could not have possibly created this legend on their own. So where did it come from originally? Zarins decided to find out. His quest for the Garden of Eden had begun. His first clue came from the very word, Eden. How this word came to be in the Bible has always been something of a mystery, because it is not native to Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament.
Eden doesn't translate literally with a Hebrew translation or any kind of Semitic translation. It's not a word that's particular to the language of the story that we're familiar with. They knew the story from somewhere else because they incorporated some of that language.
Where did the ancient Hebrews first hear this word? Zarins knew it came from an area about 800 miles to the east of the Holy Land, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. He also knew it dated back to the world's oldest known civilization, the first people to create an organized urban society, the Sumerians.
The Sumerians would be the earliest groups of people who settled and began to cultivate the land in the area of the Tigris-Euphrates. Sumer is the first really organized group of agricultural city-states, and they began to develop a network of interaction through their crops and their trade and using the rivers.
It was these ancient people who first used the word Eden.
It's a very, very ancient word, which the Sumerians used in a very ancient way, and it means a land of steppes or grasslands where people live kind of wild, where animals are wild.
The Sumerians used the term Eden to refer to uncultivated areas beyond their territory. In other words, the sort of place where nature was not controlled by man, but by God. If this word, Eden, came from Mesopotamia, then it seemed logical that the Garden of Eden was located there. This idea was supported by the fact that many early Bible stories have Mesopotamian roots.
If you look at the history of the biblical people, if you look at an Abraham, a biblical Abraham, he came from somewhere in that region.
For example, most people don't know that Sumer's mentioned in Genesis is called Shinar. The Tower of Babel, these are all Sumerian stories.
In fact, the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis, up to the point where Abraham departs for Egypt, takes place in Mesopotamia.
Everything in those stories is from Mesopotamia. If you don't believe me, read it.
In the 1980s, Zarins' curiosity piqued, and he formally took up the quest that he had been informally pursuing for years. He started a study group to test out the idea that the Garden of Eden was a real place and discover where that place was. If he couldn't convince his own students his ideas were right, he wouldn't be able to convince anyone.
We met in his office, because there were like 5 of us. We talked about some of these things. It made a lot of sense to him, and it didn't take him long to talk us into seeing the logic of it. And at that point, he was still our professor. He wasn't somebody I'd spent 20 years working with. He was my professor. So clearly he knew something.
Zarins' starting point was the Bible itself, and its first, oldest part, the book of Genesis.
Well, I should perhaps explain that the Bible has 2 accounts of creation. The Garden of Eden story is the second one, and probably the earlier one.
The story begins when God plants a garden eastward in Eden. There, he made every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And of course, in the middle of the garden, he put the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
The story is one way of showing how the human world came to be as we know it, or as the Israelites knew it. And there was a kind of a test in the garden. There are these 2 trees, the tree of life, which the first humans are not barred from eating from, which gives immortality, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which gives some kind of wisdom.
As every Sunday school student knows, one day, a serpent tempts Eve into eating the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge.
So she eats of the tree of knowledge and gives some to her husband, Adam, who meekly follows.
As punishment, God casts Adam and Eve out of the garden. and later destroyed Eden along with the rest of the earth in the great biblical flood. And yet, ever since that day, people have sought to find Eden, or at least evidence that it truly existed. The very text of the Bible actually provides some tantalizing clues about Eden's possible location.
Genesis 2 to 3, the famous story, has some verses in verses 10 to 14 where a river is said to come out of the Garden of Eden, and it becomes 4 headwaters. And the rivers in question are Tigris and Euphrates, and we all know where they are. They're the major rivers of Mesopotamia, the modern Iraq.
The other 2 rivers are called the Pishon and the Gihon. Unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates, which still flow today, no one knew where these other 2 rivers once ran, or if they ever really existed. It appears these 2 rivers have always been quite obscure, even in biblical times. In fact, the first known mention of them is the Bible itself.
Quite a bit more is said about those 2 rivers in the text, which probably implies that to the ancient Hebrews too, those rivers were a bit more unknown and mysterious, so required a bit of elaboration.
The Pishon is said to encompass a mineral-rich land called Havilah, and the Gihon is said to flow through a land called Cush. Some versions of the Bible translate Cush as Ethiopia. Locating these 2 rivers and where they joined with the Tigris and Euphrates to form the famous 4 headwaters was the key to unlocking the mystery of Eden's position. Find the rivers, and Zarins would find Eden.
What happens is it just says there were 4 rivers, and they made 1 river, and that's where the garden is. I mean, if everybody knew where the 4 rivers was, the biblical scholars would have solved this question years ago.
The location of the Pishon and the Gihon has baffled scholars for centuries. Many medieval thinkers thought the Pishon might be the river Ganges, India's holiest river. As for the Gihon, even today, most biblical scholars believe that it refers to the river Nile.
Now, the text says, the river Gihon flows around the whole land of Cush. And Cush, everywhere else in the Old Testament, means Nubia or the Sudan. And Jewish tradition was very strongly convinced of that over many centuries. It didn't deviate. And the fact that it goes all the way around the land of Cush, which is the name for Sudan, south of Egypt, the Nile is the only important river there.
But that interpretation presented a serious problem. The Nile isn't anywhere near the Tigris or the Euphrates. So there is no place on Earth where it could join with them and the Pishon to form the all-important 4 headwaters, the location of the Garden of Eden.
The ancient Israelites' knowledge of distant geography wasn't perfect. Their geography is a bit confused because we know the Nile doesn't really join up anywhere near the Tigris-Euphrates.
If the authors of the Bible made such fundamental errors like connecting the Nile to the Euphrates, how could they be trusted about anything else? The Garden of Eden could be literally anywhere. For hundreds of years, scholars have faced this exact problem, and some of them found a very inventive solution. They put the Garden of Eden wherever they wanted.
Well, a president of Boston University, no less, in the 19th century called William Warren, who located the Garden of Eden at the North Pole. Mormons locate the Garden of Eden in Jackson County, Missouri, in the United States. Columbus thought he'd found it by the Orinoco River in Venezuela. There were some who wanted to locate it in China. Well, if you think the Garden of Eden in the East, well, put it in the Far East.
But for Zarins, the Bible's incoherent geography left him at a dead end. If he tried to follow its directions to Eden, he would be lost wandering in the wilderness forever. It was the same fate that had befallen every Eden seeker of the past. But Zarins found a way around the impasse. His solution was to abandon his Bible studies and turn instead to a more traditional academic discipline: history. Zarins knew that the word Eden had come from the world's first civilization, the Sumerians. Sumer also happens to be the one place where two of the four biblical rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, touch. This offered Zarins and his group another avenue to explore. The Sumerians were the world's first people to use writing, and by recording their thoughts for posterity, they quite literally invented history.
They created writing in order to make sure who got what came from who did it, who paid taxes and who didn't. So somebody didn't say, I paid, I didn't pay, oh, I can't remember, did I pay, did I not pay? Now they're writing it down and go, no, it says here you didn't, right?
Although writing was invented as a means of bookkeeping, the Sumerians quickly found it was a useful tool for recording other ideas.
Later on, they got around to writing down things like people were sitting around thinking great thoughts and wrote down their stories. Yeah.
One of those stories was of particular importance to the Eden Project, a tale that quite possibly is the world's oldest written story.
Every culture, be it a literate culture or a non-literate culture, has a creation story, has a story that says this is how we came to be, this is what happened. And if you look at that root story, the oldest written version of a creation story comes to us from the Sumerians.
The story the Sumerians wrote is known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it has some shocking similarities to the story of Eden. Similarities which would help guide Zarins on his quest.
Gilgamesh was a king of Uruk in Mesopotamia who was 2/3 god and 1/3 man. And that was his problem. Because he was only 2/3 god, he was not immortal, but destined to die like those of us who are 3/3 human. He became overwhelmed with a sense of his own human mortality, so he wanted to find the secret of immortality.
In his search for the secret of immortality, Gilgamesh meets various characters who explain to him how humans came to be.
The Sumerians talk about man being created from clay, which makes sense. They're a river culture, so what is the substance that's most useful and most abundant? It's clay.
Men were created out of clay. Okay, and as they were created out of clay, then they said, well, now wait a minute, we got to get women in here somehow, so then we get women made out of men, and then we put them in a place where people live forever, or it was really nice, and nobody got sick, people lived at the bequest of God. You know, that's that kind of story.
When compared to the story of Eden, this earlier creation story has a distinctly familiar ring. Adam, too, was created out of clay, and Eve was created out of Adam's body. And the Sumerian idea of a land where there is no unhappiness, illness, or death has an obvious parallel to the Garden of Eden itself. The one difference is that the Sumerians did not call their version of paradise Eden. They called it Dilmun.
Dilmun refers to a place. It's a specific place. It's a settled paradise. It's an abundance. All blessings of nature sort of come together. It's a way to live without worry.
The similarities are uncanny, even down to the way both Dilmun and Eden are eventually destroyed in a great flood.
So man is created from clay to serve the gods. In serving the gods, man becomes annoying to the gods. And the gods say, oh, we need to make this go away. And they make it rain. So there's a flood story. Someone is saved, and they go on to then repopulate the earth.
In the Sumerian version of the story, the man who was saved and repopulates the earth is not called Noah. His name is Utnapishtim. And in return for saving humanity, one remorseful God grants him the gift of eternal life.
Gilgamesh is looking at this and saying, well, how do I get eternal life? So he's going to go searching for it.
Gilgamesh, the Sumerian god king, seeks out Utnapishtim, hoping the old man will reveal the secret of living forever. When they meet, Utnapishtim realizes that Gilgamesh is a hero, worthy of immortality, and tells him how to achieve it.
Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that the secret of immortality is for him to find the plant of life and to eat from this.
He also tells Gilgamesh that the plant will be underwater, in the place where paradise once stood, the land of Dilmun.
It is a clue to scholars to say, well, where is he searching for this? And the answer is the land of Dilmun, which is the land of paradise.
After an epic journey, Gilgamesh reaches Dilmun. But just when he has immortality within his grasp, disaster strikes.
He finds this plant of life in the water, and he's just going to grasp it and consume it. But unfortunately for him, a serpent snatches it away first, and the serpent rejuvenates itself.
This tale of humankind being offered the chance of eternal life, only to have it snatched away, is of course exactly the same fate that befalls Adam and Eve.
There is a moral in this story that immortality is something just beyond a human's grasp. And there is a similar theme in the Garden of Eden story, that the human beings were originally not debarred from eating of the tree of life, but because they disobeyed God and ate of the tree of knowledge, they are cast out of the garden and lose the chance of eating of the tree of life, so in a sense are doomed from the chance of having an immortal existence in this life.
As far as Zarins was concerned, it was clear that the story of Eden was nothing more than a Hebrew interpretation of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
I would say it was the same thing, because Adam transgresses and Eve, and so they're punished by having mortality, and they have to work for a living.
When ancient Hebrews heard these Sumerian stories, Zarins believes they decided to make them their own and put them in the Bible.
The biblical story changed the Mesopotamian story, if you like. It monotheized it, so it's not simply taking over a pagan story. It's now only one God who brings the flood and delivers a flood hero. There's a proper reason for the flood. It's because of humans' sin.
Unfortunately, the story itself did not seem to offer any obvious clues to Eden's location. It seemed like yet another dead end. But there was one thing that offered Zarins a glimmer of hope. The name the Sumerians used for their version of paradise, Dilmun. If he couldn't find Eden, perhaps he could find Dilmun. Zarins was not the first person to make the connection between Eden and Dilmun. Ever since the Sumerian language was first decrypted, scholars have suggested that the two places might somehow be linked.
Dilmun is interesting because it's debated is supposed to be this idealized paradise, this special place that's very advanced, where civilization and culture thrive. It would be like in Atlantis. We have this mystery place where these incredible advances happen.
As far as anyone knew, Dilmun was just a myth, a parable that had no basis in fact. If that were true, then Eden too was never likely to have been a real place. Zarins, however, knew that Dilmun was not simply a figment of the imagination. It was a real place. In fact, he was one of the people who discovered it in the 1970s. Now, in the quest for Eden, Zarins found himself revisiting his earlier work.
Yuri was in the field, going to all these places looking for evidence of early civilization, stone tools. So he was looking for these things, and I don't know if it sparked in his mind then or it sparked later as he came back and processed more and more of what he had seen. But it came together by the time I had begun to study with him as a cohesive idea.
Zarins and his colleagues found evidence of a civilization, a string of trading centers that once thrived along the eastern shores of Arabia. Today, evidence of this culture can still be seen on the Arabian island of Bahrain.
When we began to work in Saudi Arabia, we helped discover that, and it's a very, very rich region.
This discovery came as something of a surprise, considering that today, the area is little more than a vast, empty desert.
It was a place where different people congregated. It was the ancient Hong Kong. People had good stuff coming in from everywhere.
Crucially, Zarins discovered that Sumerian traders had visited this land and recorded the name of it as Dilmun.
The Sumerian cities became actively interested in trade. with any place that they could possibly trade with. So they're looking for raw materials. They bring raw materials back to Sumer, make nice things, sell them back to them at a profit. So they were in the Gulf. As soon as the Sumerians start writing, they write bingo, Dilmun. So we know that.
But why would the Sumerians think of this run-of-the-mill trading center as a paradise? The answer may lie with the distance between Dilmun and Sumer. It could only be reached by sea, and even then, only the most intrepid sailors ever went there. Just like sailors throughout history, they brought home tall tales of this faraway land.
You know how sailors are. They love places that are far away. Sailors don't talk about home. They talk about distant places so they can impress people where they've been. They found this place in the Gulf with this beautiful water, and they start talking about it.
The Sumerian sailors told of a place that was not only rich and magnificent, but lush. Unlike the dry, hard scrabble land of Sumer, Dilmun was verdant and green.
It's exotic to the Sumerians, but not exotic to local people. So, you know, they just make a transference of what it was, how beautiful it was.
Over time, Sumerians came to think of Dilmun as a special place. So much so, they assumed it was the very place where humankind was first created. Zarins had started with a cryptic biblical legend. History in the form of the world's oldest story allowed him to link Eden to the Sumerian paradise of Dilmun. Archaeology had helped him discover that Dilmun was a real place. Yet still, the Dilmun that Zarins discovered was nothing more than a desert trading outpost. There seemed nothing to support the idea of it being green and beautiful. Another roadblock on the way to the Garden of Eden. To get past it, Zarins gave up on the idea of scouring the historical record and turned instead to hard science.
His undergraduate work was in geology, so he has a background in hard science as well, which is, again, what makes him interesting. Because of all of Yuri's different talents, he brings it all together and then is, like I said, a much better storyteller because he can actually look at something both scientifically and as an anthropologist or archaeologist would.
The quest for Eden turned to the physical landscape of eastern Arabia and to the thorny question of the two missing rivers, the Gihon and the Pishon. If Zarins could not find them, then his whole quest would come to nothing.
We know the Tigris and Euphrates clearly are in Iraq at this point in time. And the question was, where would you get two other rivers that connect up with that? And that's where the science comes in.
There was no obvious way to break this impasse. Then, an answer came from the heavens. About the time that Zarins was in the thick of his quest, a revolutionary new technology came online. Satellite imagery. NASA had recently launched Landsat, a satellite designed to photograph the planet in its entirety for the first time. Today, this kind of imagery is commonplace, but in the 1980s, it was revolutionary.
You have to remember that in the late 80s, remote sensing was just beginning, and as a result of that, we're getting our first pictures, our first Landsat images were just beginning to pop up.
But simply getting hold of these images would be a challenging quest in itself. This was cutting-edge technology. A professor at an obscure Midwestern college chasing a legend was very much at the back of the queue.
Satellite images are really difficult to get a hold of because first they weren't that readily available. You have to beg people to produce this map for me.
Luckily, Zarins had a friend at NASA who snuck him some early low-resolution pictures. At last, Zarins was closing in on his goal. For the first time, he and his students could see the land of Dilmun in a way that had literally never been seen before.
It certainly changed things. If you're looking at an overview, if you're looking down on something like you would do with a Landsat photo, it's much more clear than if you're standing on the ground. So yes, it made a tremendous difference.
A careful study of the images revealed a shocking revelation. A river, or more specifically, a dry channel snaking through eastern Saudi Arabia. It clearly marked where a river would once have flowed.
When you put the satellite image, you can just generally see it. You can like, this is it. And then you start drawing where the other rivers are. It really makes sense.
It was the breakthrough that Zarins had been seeking since his journey began. Now, as well as the Tigris and the Euphrates, he had found a third river, the Pishon.
The river originates in northwest Saudi Arabia. It's called the Arima, and it has multiple branches, and it comes down, comes around a little bit, then it starts swinging north, and now the Arabs call it the Wadi Button, belly button river. And it comes around, and it makes a huge delta by Kuwait. This will be the Pishon.
From the ground, this dry river channel, the Pishon, is all but impossible to see. It would appear as nothing more than a slight depression in the sand.
You would have no idea. You'd just be like, oh, more desert. You know, you couldn't picture it as lush and fertile.
But using detailed images obtained from Landsat's camera, this former river stood out clearly.
And then you look down and you're like, wait a minute, that's, oh. And that, at one time, this was all water.
When it was in full flow, the people of Dilmun would have had a perpetual water source, and there would have been plenty of food along the banks. It would have been a place of abundant life.
When you realize that a dried up riverbed, it was actually once a water source, that changes the whole lay of the land. And that's a eureka moment.
However, there was a problem. The river Zarins discovered clearly provided a source of water to the Sumerian version of Eden, Dilmun. But something was missing. The place where it connected to the Tigris and the Euphrates showed no evidence of ever being the beautiful, lush garden described in the Bible's story. And also, where was the fourth river, the Gihon? It looked like yet another dead end, but having come so far, Zarins wasn't about to give up. Reviewing all his evidence, Zarins had a revelation. He was looking for a place that existed thousands of years ago. So perhaps he should not simply look for where the biblical rivers flowed, but when. He quickly realized that the last time the Pishon had any water in it was 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age.
It was an Ice Age river. All of Arabia was drained by three huge rivers in the Ice Age. And gradually, in what we call the Neolithic period, they dried up and they weren't as extensive. So when they connected up, obviously the landscape was different. And so now you have to figure out when that was. The answer is about 5,000–6,000 BC.
This element of timing is important for two reasons. First, back when this river was still flowing, the region of the Persian Gulf looked quite different to how it does today. In fact, at that time, there was no Persian Gulf. It was dry land.
The Gulf is, during the last ice age, was completely dry land because sea level fell about 200 feet, and the deepest part of the Gulf is 120 feet. You'll figure it out. It's all dry.
If there was no water in the Persian Gulf, then the combined waters of the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Pishon must have continued flowing for many more miles beyond where they meet the sea today. They would have combined to form one great river, just as described in the Bible.
The rivers connect up ahead of what is today just south or near Basra. That's where they would connect up. And now you can't see it because the Gulf's higher than what it is now.
But there was another, more important factor. 8,000 years ago, the climate of the region was totally different. At that time, monsoon rains, which today only reach the southernmost tip of Arabia, would have covered the whole peninsula with life-giving rain. It was this rain that fed the Pishon, allowing it to flow all year round. More importantly, the land around the river would not have been a harsh desert. It would have been lush and green. This is why the Sumerians thought of Dilmun as the birthplace of humanity, because it was a paradise.
The land of Eden. It would have been a steppe land with lots of little oases, marshlands, just like southern Iraq was to many people for a long time after that. It's a beautiful area. You got water, you got resources, you got mud, you can build houses, you got reeds, animals, plants, you got it all.
But although it would have undoubtedly been Eden-like, was this actually the Eden? Without the fourth river, the Gihon, it couldn't be. The Bible describes the Gihon as flowing through the land of Cush. For centuries, most scholars believed Cush referred to an area in East Africa. In fact, the King James Version of the Bible even uses the word Ethiopia. But Zarins knew there was a different interpretation. Cush could also be a reference to the area around the Zagros Mountains, located in modern-day Iran.
Then they said, oh, the Gihon, it comes out of the land of Cush. And they go, well, now, he was explaining to you that Cush is another word for Iran. See? You have to know that.
As it happens, there is a major river that still flows out of the Zagros Mountains, the land of Cush. Today, it is called the Karun.
The Karun River, which comes out of Iran, is still there, still carries water, comes out of the Zagros.
Until it was dammed in the 1970s, it too connected with the Tigris and the Euphrates, at the exact place where the newly discovered Pishon also joins. These rivers form the so-called four headwaters that flowed southward to form one great river. Zarins believed this was the location of the Garden of Eden. This last discovery was the final proof Zarins needed for his theory. Several times he was close to failure. It was only by combining his knowledge across so many disciplines that he was able to finally solve this ancient puzzle.
That's something that's a little bit unique to Yuri in that his background is diverse enough that he can put it together in a bigger picture, which is that creative aspect of being multidisciplinary. Because of all of Yuri's different talents, you know, he brings it all together and he's just a much better storyteller.
But like the maverick he is, Juris Zarins refuses to take all the credit. He believes his breakthrough only came thanks to the work of others, across many different disciplines. All he did was put these pieces of the puzzle together.
You think that's where it is, and you draw satisfaction from saying that you pushed the ball forward a little bit because you added a lot more data and made people think about it, not just from reading the text.
This was not the end of the quest. Zarins refused to rest on his laurels. For him, the location of the garden was not the most important thing. He wanted to know how true the story in the Bible was, and what it really meant. Putting together everything he had learned so far, it occurred to Zarins that the story was not really about how the first human beings were created. Instead, it was about how human society was created. The epoch-defining moment when we humans stopped being hunter-gatherers and started becoming farmers.
The Garden of Eden story is an explanation of how farming originated.
Zarins' theory rests on a radical notion, the idea that the Garden of Eden was not the only one of its kind. He believes that the whole region, the land known as Dilmun, was filled with Eden-like places.
Well, the garden no different than any oasis you see now in Arabia. Arabia, it's called an oasis because subterranean water fractures and everything turns green. Attracts plants, attracts humans, attracts animals. It's just a place where people congregate. So this was a kind of a marshy, green area that attracted animals, plants, and so on, and original people.
According to Zarins, the Garden of Eden was a home to prehistoric humans, hunter-gatherers who were able to survive purely from what they found growing naturally. But as the last ice age ended, the waters in the world's oceans began to rise. Eventually, this garden of paradise would have been drowned in the flood. In its place today, we find the Persian Gulf.
It flooded the area, and it flooded the Garden of Eden. It's flooded. It's underwater now. Can't see it.
The floods forced humans to move northwards into the much harsher landscape of Mesopotamia that we are familiar with today. There was no easy living here. If people wanted food, they had to grow it. They had to become farmers. And that meant using primitive technology to cultivate the land.
When people create inventions of some kind or another, whether it's taming nature or inventing metals or writing, you can never go back. You just can't reverse technological progress. And so it began with this idea of agriculture being one of the first ideas of change.
Zarins believes that the story of Eden was written as a lament for this extraordinary change and a yearning for the days of a simpler life. The advent of agriculture was not described as a great leap forward, but as a sin. Eve eating from the tree of knowledge.
What happened was they fell. They fell from grace. What is that? What does that mean? That means they transgressed against what God had provided. They knew better, and that's what we call the origin of agriculture. You know how to manipulate things now. You know how to make plants grow. You know how to create animals and get natural selection.
In 1987, the results of Zarins' work were published in Smithsonian Magazine.
Very satisfying to have that feeling that there's an answer, there's an explanation that is based in science as well as literature, that you can put these two things together and tell a story that is very identifiable. It's, oh, this is not so far off the mark. This works. This makes more sense than just poof, magic.
But once he put his ideas in the public sphere, Zarins discovered that many academics gave them short shrift.
Juris Zarins' views, I think, have multiple problems attached to them. The first is that the rivers Tigris and Euphrates flow down from the mountains of Armenia into the Persian Gulf area. Genesis 2 says the rivers flow out of Eden and become 4 headwaters. So that implies they are going from a higher area down to the Persian Gulf area. And so I think he's located the Garden of Eden at the wrong end. Even the ancient Hebrews knew that rivers don't flow upwards.
My rule is, if people think it's crazy, it's probably right. You know, academics being what they are, they wish they wrote it. They don't pay any attention to any of that.
But perhaps surprisingly, these theories were not so quickly rejected by people with a more religious disposition. In fact, many welcomed his work.
I would have expected, particularly here in the Bible Belt, Springfield is in the Bible Belt, I would have expected backlash. Uri spoke to more church groups, was invited to more public venues where you would have thought they would have been hostile to his ideas. And yet again, he's such a good storyteller. It's not offensive. He's in no way saying what you think is stupid. He's saying, here's a way to look at it scientifically and let your story be real. And he was welcomed in many cases with open arms. It was kind of fun to watch. I expected there to be more of a uproar.
The extraordinary insight of Juris Zarins showed that the legend of the Garden of Eden might be more than just a parable. It might be a true story, a story of how human society came to be.